The silk dress had cost more than most people in Wyatt, Missouri, earned in 3 months, and Josephine Hammond watched it tear on a rusted nail protruding from the stagecoach door within 5 minutes of her arrival. The sound of expensive fabric ripping seemed to echo across the dusty Main Street, announcing to everyone within earshot that she did not belong here. Josephine stood frozen on the wooden boardwalk, staring down at the jagged tear that ran from her hip to the hem, exposing layers of petticoats that were already turning brown from the dust that swirled through the air like a living thing. She had imagined her arrival in the frontier town would be difficult, but she had not anticipated complete humiliation before she even found her aunt's boarding house. "That is unfortunate." The voice came from behind her, deep and tinged with amusement that made Josephine's cheeks burn. She turned to find a man leaning against the post of the general store, his hat tilted back far enough that she could see his face clearly. He was probably in his mid-20s, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of whiskey that took in her ruined dress, her matching silk jacket, and the 3 massive trunks being unloaded from the stagecoach. His clothes were practical, worn denim and a faded shirt that had seen countless washings, and his boots were scuffed leather that had walked many miles. Everything about him spoke of hard work and outdoor living, while everything about her screamed expensive Eastern city. "I did not ask for commentary," Josephine said, trying to gather the shreds of her dignity along with the torn fabric. Her voice came out sharper than she intended, but the long journey from Philadelphia, the bone-rattling stagecoach ride, and now this disaster had worn her patience thin. The man pushed away from the post and walked toward her with an easy confidence that irritated her further. Up close, she could see he was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and calloused hands. A working man. A cowboy, probably, like the dozens she had seen from the stagecoach window as they approached Wyatt. "Was not commentary, miss, was observation. But if you plan on staying in Wyatt, you might want to consider that silk and ranch country do not mix well." "I am aware of that now, thank you," Josephine said, gathering her skirts and attempting to move past him toward her trunks. She needed to find her aunt's boarding house, change into something less conspicuous, and try to forget this entire mortifying encounter. "Harrison Ingram," the man said, touching the brim of his hat. "I work at the Double Bar Ranch just outside town. Your aunt, Mrs. Hammond, asked me to meet the stage and help get you settled." Josephine stopped, her embarrassment deepening. Of course. Her aunt had mentioned in her last letter that she would send someone reliable to help with the luggage. Josephine had imagined an older man, perhaps a kindly grandfather type, not this young cowboy who looked at her ruined dress with barely concealed amusement. "I see." "I apologize for my rudeness, Mr. Ingram. The journey has been trying." "No need for apologies, Miss Hammond. First day in a new place is always rough." Harrison gestured to her trunks. "Though I have to say, you brought enough luggage for a year-long stay." "Your aunt said you would be here for the summer." "That was the plan," Josephine admitted, watching as Harrison lifted one of her trunks as though it weighed nothing and carried it toward a wagon parked nearby. The muscles in his arms flexed beneath his shirt sleeves, and she found herself looking away quickly. "My father thought country air and a simpler way of life might do me good." "What did you think?" Harrison asked, returning for the second trunk. His eyes met hers directly, and she saw genuine curiosity there, not judgment. "I thought my father wanted me out of Philadelphia after I refused to marry the banker he had chosen for me," Josephine said honestly. The words surprised her. She had not intended to share personal information with this stranger, but something about his straightforward manner invited honesty in return. Harrison let out a low whistle as he hoisted the second trunk. "A banker, huh? Well, Wyatt does not have much use for those. We have one bank, and old Mr. Peterson runs it. He is about 70 and already married. Despite herself, Josephine felt a smile tug at her lips. That is a relief. By the time all 3 trunks were loaded onto the wagon, Josephine's dress had collected even more dust, and she could feel sweat trickling down her back beneath the layers of silk and cotton. The June sun beat down mercilessly, and she realized with growing dismay that she had not thought to bring a parasol within easy reach. It was packed in one of the trunks, along with most of her practical items. She had dressed to impress, to show the frontier town that she was a woman of refinement and culture. Instead, she looked like a wilting hothouse flower transported into the harsh prairie sunlight. Harrison offered his hand to help her up onto the wagon seat, and after a moment's hesitation, Josephine accepted. His palm was warm and rough against hers, the hand of someone who worked with horses and rope and tools. Her own hand felt soft and useless by comparison, and she was suddenly aware of how unprepared she was for life in Wyatt, even temporarily. The ride to the boarding house took only a few minutes, but it gave Josephine her first real look at the town her aunt had described in enthusiastic letters over the past 2 years. Wyatt was small, perhaps 200 residents if that, with a main street that boasted a general store, a saloon, a church, the bank Harrison had mentioned, a blacksmith, and a few other businesses whose purposes she could not immediately determine. The buildings were mostly wood, weathered by sun and wind, and the street itself was packed dirt that turned to mud when it rained, according to the deep ruts she could see. People moved with purpose, none of the leisurely strolling she was accustomed to in Philadelphia's parks. Everyone here seemed to have work to do and little time for idleness. "Your aunt runs the best boarding house in town," Harrison said as they turned down a side street lined with houses. "Course, it is the only boarding house in town, but it would still be the best even if there were competition. She is a fine cook and keeps everything spotless." She was always particular about cleanliness, Josephine agreed, remembering her aunt's visits to Philadelphia when Josephine was a child. Aunt Margaret had seemed exotic and adventurous then, the widow who had moved west after Uncle Thomas died, seeking new experiences instead of living quietly on her widow's pension. Now Josephine understood the appeal. There was a freedom here, despite the harsh conditions, that Philadelphia society did not offer women. The boarding house was a 2-story structure with a wide front porch and flower boxes in the windows. Aunt Margaret must have watered them faithfully because they bloomed cheerfully despite the heat. As Harrison pulled the wagon to a stop, the front door flew open and Margaret Hammond rushed out, her face alight with joy. "Josephine, oh my dear girl, you are finally here." Margaret was in her 50s, with silver threading through her dark hair and a warm smile that made Josephine feel instantly welcome. She pulled Josephine into a tight embrace before stepping back to look at her niece properly. Her smile faded slightly as she took in the ruined dress. "What on earth happened to your beautiful gown?" "Nail on the stagecoach door," Josephine explained, feeling the embarrassment wash over her again. "I should have worn something more practical, but I did not think." "No, no, do not fret about it," Margaret said, waving away her concerns. "We will get you changed into something more suitable right away. Harrison, be a dear and bring those trunks inside. The front room on the 2nd floor, as we discussed." Harrison touched his hat brim in acknowledgement and began unloading the trunks with practiced efficiency. Margaret guided Josephine inside, through a neat parlor and up a staircase with a polished banister. The boarding house was as clean and welcoming as Harrison had promised, with lace curtains, comfortable furniture, and the scent of fresh bread wafting from somewhere below. The room Margaret had prepared was spacious and bright, with windows that overlooked the street and a large bed covered in a colorful quilt. Josephine's trunks arrived moments later, carried by Harrison, who placed them carefully against one wall before nodding to both women and leaving quietly. "He seems capable," Josephine said, watching through the window as Harrison climbed back onto the wagon. "Harrison is one of the finest young men in Wyatt," Margaret said with obvious affection. "He has worked at the Double Bar Ranch since he was 16, learning everything about cattle ranching and horse breeding. The owner, Mr. Whitmore, trusts him completely. In fact, Harrison manages most of the day-to-day operations now that Mr. Whitmore's health is failing." Josephine processed this information while opening her largest trunk in search of something more appropriate to wear. She had brought several simple cotton dresses that she wore at home for morning tasks, never imagining she would need them immediately upon arrival. "Does Mr. Ingram live at the ranch?" "He has a small house there, yes. Many of the ranch hands live in the bunkhouse, but Harrison earned his own place after he saved the ranch during a terrible winter 3 years ago. Most of the cattle would have died if not for his quick thinking and hard work." Margaret helped Josephine unlace the ruined silk dress, chattering comfortably about Harrison's many virtues, until Josephine began to suspect her aunt had matchmaking intentions. The thought was not entirely unpleasant, which surprised Josephine. She had spent the last 6 months fighting her father's attempts to marry her off to his banker colleague, a pompous man 20 years her senior who viewed her as a decorative addition to his household. Harrison was completely different, younger, only a few years older than her own 22 years, and clearly respected for his abilities rather than his bank account. Still, she had come to Wyatt to escape marriage pressure, not to find a husband. Once Josephine had changed into a simple blue cotton dress that was far more appropriate for the climate, Margaret insisted she come down to the kitchen for something to eat and drink. The other boarders would not return until evening, Margaret explained, so they had time to catch up properly. Over cold lemonade and slices of apple pie, Margaret asked about the family in Philadelphia, and Josephine shared news of her parents, her younger brother who was studying law, and the social expectations that had driven her to accept her aunt's invitation to spend the summer in Missouri. Margaret listened with understanding, having herself fled society's restrictions after her husband's death. "You will find life here very different," Margaret said gently. "People are judged by their character and their work, not their bloodlines or bank accounts. Women have more freedom in some ways, though the work is harder. You will need to adjust your expectations, my dear." "I am willing to try," Josephine said, meaning it. The glimpse she had gotten of Wyatt so far intrigued her. It was rough and dusty and nothing like Philadelphia, but there was an honesty to it that appealed to something deep inside her. The rest of the afternoon passed pleasantly as Margaret showed Josephine around the boarding house and introduced her to the layout of the town. By evening, when the other boarders returned, Josephine had met the schoolteacher, a young woman named Sarah who was only a few years older than herself, and 2 clerks who worked at the general store. Everyone was friendly and welcoming, asking polite questions about Philadelphia, but not prying into her reasons for coming west. That night, lying in the comfortable bed in her new room, Josephine listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the frontier town settling in for sleep. Dogs barking in the distance, the low of cattle from somewhere beyond the town limits, the creak of wood as the house cooled from the day's heat. It was nothing like the city sound she was accustomed to, but she found them oddly soothing. Her last thought before sleep claimed her was of Harrison Ingram's whiskey-colored eyes, and the way he had looked at her ruined dress with amusement, rather than scorn. The next morning brought her first real challenge. Josephine woke early, accustomed to her schedule in Philadelphia, and dressed in another simple cotton dress before heading downstairs. She found Margaret already in the kitchen, preparing breakfast for the boarders, and immediately offered to help. "Can you cook?" Margaret asked with surprise and perhaps a touch of skepticism. "I can learn," Josephine said firmly. "I want to be useful while I am here, Aunt Margaret. I do not wish to be a burden." Margaret's face softened. "You could never be a burden, dear, but if you truly want to help, I will teach you." Be warned, though cooking for a boarding house is nothing like supervising a cook in a fine kitchen. Josephine rolled up her sleeves. "I am ready." The morning was a disaster. Josephine burned the first batch of biscuits, oversalted the gravy, and managed to crack eggs so poorly that shells ended up in the scramble. Margaret remained patient throughout, correcting her mistakes gently and showing her the proper techniques. By the time the boarders sat down to eat, the food was acceptable if not exceptional, and Josephine's arms ached from work she had never done before. Sarah, the schoolteacher, smiled encouragingly as she accepted her plate. "My first attempts at cooking were far worse. You will improve quickly, I am sure." After breakfast, Josephine helped Margaret clean the dishes, learning the proper way to heat water on the wood stove and wash everything efficiently. Her hands grew red from the hot water and strong soap, and she understood with new clarity how much work went into keeping a household running. In Philadelphia, servants had done all of this invisible labor. Here, there were no servants, just people doing what needed to be done. Around mid-morning, a knock at the door interrupted their work. Margaret answered it, and Josephine heard Harrison's voice from the front hallway. Curious, she dried her hands and joined her aunt. Harrison stood on the porch, hat in hand, looking slightly uncomfortable. "Morning, Mrs. Hammond." "I was wondering if Miss Hammond might want to visit the ranch today." Mr. Whitmore heard she had arrived and wanted to extend an invitation. He thought she might enjoy seeing how we operate out here. Margaret looked at Josephine with raised eyebrows, clearly leaving the decision to her niece. Josephine hesitated, aware that her aunt was giving her space to make her own choices. The invitation was unexpected, but she found herself curious about the ranch, and if she was honest, about seeing Harrison again. "I would enjoy that very much," Josephine said. "Though I should warn you, I know absolutely nothing about cattle or horses." "That is fine," Harrison said, and she caught the hint of a smile at the corners of his mouth. "We all started somewhere. Fair warning, though ranches are dusty, dirty places. You might want to wear something you do not mind getting ruined." Josephine glanced down at her cotton dress, which was already showing signs of her morning's kitchen disasters. "This will have to do. I do not have any work clothes." Harrison's smile grew wider. "Wait here a moment." He strode back to his wagon and rummaged in a box in the back, returning with a bundle of folded fabric. These belonged to Mr. Whitmore's daughter before she married and moved to Kansas City. She left a bunch of her old clothes behind, said anyone who needed them could have them. "They might fit you, and they are meant for ranch work." Josephine took the bundle, feeling the rough fabric of denim and sturdy cotton. Work clothes. Real frontier clothing, nothing like the delicate dresses in her trunks upstairs. She looked up at Harrison and saw no mockery in his expression, just practical helpfulness. He was trying to make her life easier, not make fun of her inadequacy. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I will go change." Upstairs, Josephine unfolded the clothes and found a pair of split riding skirts made from heavy denim, several cotton shirts with simple buttons, and a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better days but would provide essential sun protection. The clothes were worn but clean, and when she put them on, they fit reasonably well, if a bit loose in places. She looked at herself in the small mirror above her dresser and barely recognized the woman looking back. Gone was the fashionable Philadelphia lady. In her place stood someone who might actually survive on the frontier. When she came back downstairs, Margaret's eyes widened with approval. "Now you look ready for Wyatt," her aunt said warmly. "Those are much more sensible." Harrison's reaction was harder to read. His eyes traveled over her new outfit, and something flickered in his expression before he nodded. "Much better. You will be more comfortable, and you will not ruin any more expensive dresses." The ride to the Double Bar Ranch took about 30 minutes, following a well-worn trail that led away from town into rolling prairie land. Harrison drove the wagon with easy competence, pointing out landmarks and explaining the geography as they went. Josephine listened, fascinated despite herself by his knowledge of the land. He could identify plants by their leaves, predict where water might be found by reading the landscape, and spot cattle in the distance long before Josephine's eyes could make them out. "You really love this life," she observed, watching his face as he talked about the ranch. Harrison glanced at her, seeming to consider his answer carefully. "It is the only life I know. My parents died when I was 14, cholera outbreak. I had no other family, so I started working wherever I could find jobs. Mr. Whitmore took me on when I was 16, taught me everything about running a ranch. This land, this work, it is home to me." "I am sorry about your parents," Josephine said softly. Her own complaints about her father's matchmaking attempts seemed trivial compared to the loss Harrison had endured. "It was a long time ago," Harrison said, but she could hear the old grief beneath the words. "You learn to keep moving forward. That is all you can do." The Double Bar Ranch came into view gradually, spreading across a valley between gentle hills. Josephine saw the main house first, a sprawling structure that had clearly been expanded over the years. Then the various outbuildings, barns, stables, a bunkhouse, storage sheds, and corrals where horses moved restlessly in the morning heat. Cattle dotted the landscape in every direction, grazing peacefully on prairie grass. A man stepped out onto the porch of the main house as they approached, leaning heavily on a cane. He was elderly, probably in his 70s, with white hair and a weathered face that spoke of decades spent outdoors. "This had to be Mr. Whitmore. Harrison, you brought our visitor." The old man's voice was surprisingly strong despite his obvious physical frailty. "Miss Hammond, welcome to the Double Bar. I hope my ranch manager did not talk your ear off on the drive out here." "Not at all," Josephine said as Harrison helped her down from the wagon. "He was very informative." "Informative. That is Harrison, all right. The man knows this ranch better than I do at this point, and I have owned it for 40 years. Mr. Whitmore gestured toward the house. "Come inside, have some coffee, and then Harrison can show you around properly." The interior of the ranch house was comfortable in a lived-in way, with sturdy furniture and walls decorated with landscapes and family photographs. Mr. Whitmore settled into a chair with a grateful sigh while Harrison poured coffee from a pot on the stove. Josephine accepted her cup and sat across from the ranch owner, curious about why he had wanted to meet her. "Your aunt speaks very highly of you," Mr. Whitmore began. "Says you are smart, well-educated, and looking for something different from city life." "That about right, more or less," Josephine admitted. "Though I am not sure I am looking for anything specific. Perhaps just space to figure out what I want without my father's expectations hanging over me." Mr. Whitmore chuckled. "Fair enough. Well, if you want to understand life out here, this ranch is a good place to start. Harrison, why do not you show Miss Hammond the operation? Start with the horses, she might enjoy that." Harrison set down his coffee cup and nodded. "Yes, sir." "Miss Hammond, if you are ready." They left Mr. Whitmore resting in his chair and headed toward the stables. The morning sun was climbing higher, bringing with it serious heat, and Josephine was grateful for the wide-brimmed hat that shaded her face. Harrison led her to a large stable where several horses peered out from their stalls, their ears pricked forward with curiosity. "You ride?" Harrison asked, running his hand along the neck of a beautiful chestnut mare. "I have had riding lessons," Josephine said carefully. "But only in controlled environments. I have never ridden across open country." "This is Rosie," Harrison said, indicating the chestnut mare. "She is as gentle as they come. If you want to learn real riding while you are here, she would be a good teacher." Josephine reached out tentatively to touch the horse's soft nose, feeling the warm breath against her palm. Rosie whickered softly, a friendly sound that made Josephine smile. "She is beautiful." "She is a good girl," Harrison agreed. "Most of our horses are working animals. We use them for herding cattle, checking fence lines, all the daily tasks that keep this place running. But we have a few like Rosie who are just for riding pleasure." He moved down the line of stalls, introducing Josephine to each horse and explaining its personality and purpose. She was struck by how much he cared for these animals, the gentleness in his rough hands as he touched them, the affection in his voice when he talked about their quirks and habits. This was not just a job to him. It was a calling. After the stables, Harrison showed her the cattle operation, explaining the breeding program Mr. Whitmore had developed over the years to produce hardy animals suited to Missouri's climate. He pointed out the different breeds, discussed the challenges of raising cattle, and described the annual cattle drive to the railhead where they sold their stock. Josephine listened, absorbing information about a world she had never considered before. They were standing by one of the corrals, watching a group of young cattle when one of the ranch hands approached. He was younger than Harrison, probably 19 or 20, with a nervous energy that suggested he had urgent news. "Harrison, we have got a problem with the north fence line. Looks like someone cut the wire deliberately. About 20 head of cattle got out onto the Mackey property." Harrison's expression hardened. "Deliberately cut, you are sure?" "Yes, sir. Clean cuts, not breaks from the cattle pushing. And there are boot prints all around the area that do not match any of ours." "The Mackey Ranch," Harrison said quietly, though Josephine could hear the tension in his voice. He turned to her apologetically. "I am sorry, Miss Hammond, but I need to deal with this immediately. Ranch business. I can have one of the other hands drive you back to town. Could I come with you?" The question surprised Josephine as much as it seemed to surprise Harrison. "I mean, if I would not be in the way, I would like to see how you handle problems like this." Harrison studied her for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether she was serious. Whatever he saw in her expression must have convinced him because he nodded slowly. "It might get tense. The Mackey Ranch and the Double Bar have had disputes before over land boundaries and water rights. But if you want to come, you can." 20 minutes later, Josephine found herself on horseback for the first time since her controlled riding lessons in Philadelphia's parks. Harrison had saddled Rosie for her, showing her the proper way to mount and adjust her position. Rosie lived up to her gentle reputation, responding to Josephine's tentative commands with patient compliance. They rode north across Double Bar land with the young ranch hand, whose name was Tommy, leading the way. Harrison rode beside Josephine, keeping a watchful eye on her riding but not hovering. The movement of the horse beneath her, the open sky above, and the vast landscape stretching in all directions created a feeling of freedom Josephine had never experienced before. Despite the problem they were riding toward, she found herself exhilarated. The damaged fence line was exactly as Tommy had described, clean cuts through the wire, deliberately sabotaged. Harrison dismounted and examined the area carefully, his face grim. Beyond the fence, on Mackey land, Josephine could see some of the double-bar cattle grazing peacefully. "Whoever did this knew what they were doing," Harrison said. "The cuts are placed to make the fence collapse completely, creating a wide gap. This was not random vandalism." "What are you going to do?" Josephine asked from atop Rosie, feeling out of her depth but wanting to understand. "First, we get our cattle back. Then I need to talk to Jack Mackey." Harrison mounted his horse again and looked at Tommy. "Ride back to the ranch and bring 3 more men. We will need help moving the cattle, and tell Mr. Whitmore what is happening." Tommy rode off at a gallop while Harrison led Josephine around the fence line to a gate that connected the 2 properties. The gate was locked from the Mackey side, which complicated things, but Harrison dismounted and climbed over it with practiced ease, then unlocked it from the inside so Josephine could ride through. They found the double-bar cattle about a quarter-mile into Mackey land, mixed in with some of Mackey's herd. Harrison began the work of separating them out, and Josephine watched in fascination as he maneuvered his horse with subtle signals, using the animal's movements to guide the cattle where he wanted them. It was like a dance, horse and rider working as one. "Can I help?" Josephine called out, feeling useless just watching. Harrison paused, considering. "Stay on Rosie's right side and move slowly toward that group of 3. Just walk Rosie forward gently. She knows what to do. The cattle will probably move away from you, and that is what we want. They should start heading back toward the gate." Josephine did as instructed, her heart pounding with nervousness. But Harrison was right. Rosie seemed to understand the task instinctively, and the cattle moved away from them with minimal fuss. Josephine felt a surge of accomplishment as the animals ambled in the direction Harrison wanted. They were making good progress when riders appeared on the horizon, approaching fast. Harrison saw them and moved his horse between them and Josephine, a protective gesture that she noticed even though he probably did not realize he had done it. The riders turned out to be Jack Mackey and 2 of his ranch hands. Mackey was a big man, probably in his 40s, with a thick beard and an aggressive posture that put Josephine immediately on edge. He reined in his horse hard, making it dance nervously. "What the hell are you doing on my land, Ingram?" Mackey demanded, his voice loud and angry. "Retrieving double-bar cattle that ended up on your property when someone cut our fence," Harrison said calmly, though Josephine could see the tension in his shoulders. 20 head. We will have them off your land within the hour. Cut your fence. That is a serious accusation." Mackey's eyes narrowed dangerously. "You saying I had something to do with it?" "I am saying someone cut our fence and our cattle ended up on your land. I am not making accusations, just stating facts." Harrison's voice remained level, but there was steel underneath the calm. "We have no quarrel with you, Mackey. We just want our animals back." Mackey's gaze shifted to Josephine, and she saw his expression change to surprise. "Who is this? You bringing ladies on ranch business now, Ingram?" "Miss Hammond is visiting from Philadelphia," Harrison said, and Josephine heard the warning in his tone. "She is a guest of Mrs. Hammond in town and of Mr. Whitmore at the ranch." "Philadelphia," Mackey repeated, looking Josephine up and down in a way that made her skin crawl. "Fancy Eastern lady playing at ranch life. Does she know what kind of man you really are, Ingram? Did you tell her about—" "That is enough," Harrison interrupted sharply. "Miss Hammond, please ride back to the gate. Wait for me there." Josephine wanted to argue, to insist she could handle whatever was about to happen, but something in Harrison's expression convinced her to obey. She turned Rosie and walked the mare back toward the gate, though she kept glancing over her shoulder to make sure the situation was not escalating into violence. The men's voices carried across the distance, sharp with anger on Mackie's side and carefully controlled on Harrison's. Josephine could not make out all the words, but the tension was obvious. Then, Tommy returned with the other ranch hands, and the presence of more men seemed to diffuse the situation. Mackie and his hands rode off in one direction, while Harrison and the double-bar men finished gathering the cattle and driving them back through the gate. Once they were back on double-bar land, Harrison supervised the repairs to the fence while Josephine watched from a safe distance. The men worked efficiently, stringing new wire and securing it properly. No one spoke much, the mood somber after the confrontation with Mackie. Finally, Harrison rode over to where Josephine waited. His face was closed off, harder than she had seen it before. "I apologize that you had to witness that. Ranch disputes can get ugly." "What did he mean about you not telling me who you really are?" Josephine asked directly. "What was he referring to?" Harrison's jaw tightened. "Old history. Nothing that matters now." It seemed to matter to him. "Mackie has reasons to dislike me that have nothing to do with ranch business," Harrison said curtly. "Can we leave it at that?" Josephine wanted to push for more information, but she recognized the walls going up in his expression. Whatever the history was, he was not ready to share it, and she had no right to demand his secrets when they barely knew each other. "Of course, I apologize for prying." Some of the hardness left Harrison's face. "You did not pry. You asked a fair question. I am just not ready to answer it yet." He paused, then added more gently, "You did well today. Most women I know would have been terrified during that confrontation. You kept your head." "I was terrified," Josephine admitted. "I just did not want to show it." Harrison's smile was brief but genuine. "That is called courage, Miss Hammond. Doing what needs to be done, even when you are scared." They rode back to the main ranch house in companionable silence, though Josephine's mind churned with questions about the confrontation, about Harrison's past, and about the complications of frontier life that were so different from anything she had experienced in Philadelphia. When they arrived, Mr. Whitmore was waiting on the porch, his weathered face concerned. "Tommy told me what happened," the old man said. "Jack Mackie causing trouble again." "Nothing I could not handle," Harrison said, dismounting and helping Josephine down from Rosie. "But the fence was definitely cut deliberately. We need to keep closer watch on that section of the property line." "Agreed. Come inside, both of you. You have earned lunch." Mr. Whitmore led them into the house, where a middle-aged woman Josephine had not met before had laid out a simple meal of bread, cheese, cold meat, and vegetables. She introduced herself as Mrs. Chen, the ranch's cook and housekeeper, and insisted Josephine eat heartily after her morning's adventure. Over lunch, Mr. Whitmore asked Josephine what she thought of ranch life so far, and she answered honestly, describing both her fascination and her awareness of how little she knew. The old rancher listened carefully, occasionally glancing at Harrison with an expression Josephine could not quite read. "You have good instincts," Mr. Whitmore finally said. "Harrison told me you asked to come along to deal with the fence problem instead of going back to town." Most visitors would have chosen comfort over experience. "I came to Wyatt to learn about a different way of life," Josephine said. "I cannot do that by staying comfortable." "She did well," Harrison added quietly. "Kept calm during the confrontation and actually helped move the cattle before Mackie showed up." Mr. Whitmore's eyes sparkled with what looked like satisfaction. "Did she now? Well, Miss Hammond, if you are interested in learning more about ranch operations, you are welcome here any time. Harrison can teach you as much or as little as you want to know." "I would like that very much," Josephine said, and realized she meant it completely. The morning had been challenging and even frightening at moments, but it had also been exhilarating in a way her Philadelphia life had never been. Harrison drove her back to town in the late afternoon, the wagon rumbling along the familiar trail. They talked more easily now, the morning's shared experience having created a bond between them. Harrison told her stories about the ranch, about learning to ride and rope and handle cattle, about the satisfaction of hard work and the beauty of the land. Josephine shared stories of Philadelphia, of the social constraints and expectations that had made her feel trapped, of her love for reading and learning that her father dismissed as unwomanly. "Your father sounds like he does not know you very well," Harrison observed as they approached Wyatt. "He knows the daughter he wants me to be," Josephine said. "He has never been very interested in the daughter I actually am." "His loss," Harrison said simply, and the quiet certainty in his voice warmed something inside Josephine's chest. When they reached the boarding house, Harrison helped her down from the wagon and retrieved the bundle of work clothes she had left behind that morning. "Keep these," he said. "You will need them if you are going to be spending time at the ranch. Are you sure?" They belonged to Mr. Whitmore's daughter, and she said anyone who needed them could have them. "You need them." Harrison handed her the bundle. "Same time tomorrow if you want. There is always more to learn." "Tomorrow," Josephine agreed, clutching the work clothes to her chest. "Thank you, Harrison, for everything today." "My pleasure, Miss Hammond." He touched the brim of his hat and climbed back onto the wagon, and Josephine stood on the porch watching him drive away until Margaret called her inside for supper. That night, helping her aunt prepare the evening meal with slightly more competence than the morning's disaster, Josephine could not stop thinking about the day. About the feel of Rosie beneath her, the vast open landscape, the tension of the confrontation with Mackie, and most of all about Harrison. The way he had positioned himself protectively between her and potential danger, the patience with which he had taught her about the ranch. The shadows in his eyes when Mackie had mentioned his past. She barely knew him, she reminded herself. One day of acquaintance was hardly enough to form any real judgment of a person's character. And yet, she found herself looking forward to tomorrow with an eagerness she had not felt about anything in a very long time. The next morning, Josephine was up before dawn, helping Margaret prepare breakfast with gradually improving skills. She dressed in the work clothes Harrison had given her, braiding her long dark hair into a practical plait that would stay out of her way. When Harrison arrived with the wagon, Margaret sent them off with a packed lunch and a knowing smile that made Josephine blush. The second day at the Double Bar Ranch was even more enlightening than the first. Harrison taught her how to properly saddle a horse, showing her each step, and then watching as she did it herself. His hands guided hers when she struggled with the cinch, his touch impersonal but warm, and Josephine found herself acutely aware of his closeness. They spent the morning riding the fence lines, checking for damage and weak spots. Harrison explained how to read the land, pointing out where water collected during rains, which plants indicated good grazing, and how to spot signs of wildlife. Josephine absorbed everything, asking questions and trying to memorize the wealth of information he shared so freely. Around midday, they stopped by a creek to water the horses and eat the lunch Margaret had packed. Sitting on the creek bank with the sound of water flowing over rocks, Josephine felt more relaxed than she had in months. There was something about being away from the pressures of society, away from her father's expectations and Philadelphia's rigid social rules, that allowed her to breathe deeply for the first time in years. "Can I ask you something?" Harrison said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Why did you really come to Wyatt? I know you said your father wanted you to marry someone you did not want to marry, but there must have been other ways to avoid that. This is a long way to run." Josephine considered her answer carefully, wanting to be honest. My father does not understand me. He sees me as a commodity to be traded for social advantage. The banker he wanted me to marry is wealthy and well-connected, and that was all that mattered to my father. When I refused, he became angry. Not because I was unhappy, but because I was disrupting his plans. My mother tried to mediate, but she has never had much power in our household. She paused, watching the water flow past. Aunt Margaret's letters have always made Wyatt sound like a place where people have room to be themselves. I wanted to experience that, even if only for a summer. And now that you are here, is it what you expected? It is harder than I expected, Josephine admitted. And more wonderful. I ruined an expensive dress, learned I cannot cook, discovered that ranching is backbreaking work, and got caught in the middle of a property dispute. And yet, I feel more alive than I have in years. Harrison smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face. That is the frontier for you. Everything is harder and simpler at the same time. What about you? Josephine asked, emboldened by his openness. What do you want from life? Will you run the double bar forever? Mr. Whitmore has talked about selling me the ranch when he passes, Harrison said slowly, as if the words were precious and needed to be handled carefully. Or at least the majority share. He has no children living nearby to take it over, and he knows I love this land. But that is a big responsibility, and a ranch this size requires capital I do not have saved yet. You would be a good owner, Josephine said with certainty. You care about the land and the animals, and the men respect you. Thank you for that. Harrison's eyes met hers, and Josephine felt something shift between them, some unspoken acknowledgement of growing connection. It means a lot coming from you. They might have said more, but the sound of approaching horses interrupted the moment. Harrison stood quickly, his hand moving instinctively toward the rifle in his saddle scabbard. Two riders appeared through the trees, and Harrison relaxed slightly when he recognized them as double-bar ranch hands. Harrison, Mr. Whitmore sent us to find you, one of them called out. He needs you back at the ranch right away, says it is important. The ride back was swift, and Josephine could feel Harrison's tension as they approached the ranch house. Mr. Whitmore was indeed waiting, seated on the porch with a letter in his hand, and an expression that mixed concern with something else Josephine could not identify. What is wrong? Harrison asked, dismounting quickly. Nothing is wrong exactly, Mr. Whitmore said slowly. But this letter arrived from my lawyer in Kansas City. It concerns the ranch's future, and it concerns you. We need to talk, Harrison, privately. Harrison glanced at Josephine apologetically. I am sorry, Miss Hammond. This might take a while. Of course. I can ride back to town if you point me in the right direction, Josephine offered, though the thought of navigating alone made her nervous. Absolutely not, Harrison said firmly. I will take you back when we are finished here. Mrs. Chen will keep you company in the kitchen, if you do not mind waiting. Mrs. Chen proved to be excellent company, chatting with Josephine about her own journey from China to Missouri, and teaching her how to prepare several dishes that worked well for feeding ranch hands. The older woman had a dry sense of humor and a wealth of stories about the ranch's history. Time passed quickly, but Josephine could not help wondering what was being discussed in Mr. Whitmore's office. When Harrison finally emerged an hour later, his face was difficult to read. He thanked Mrs. Chen for looking after Josephine and led her outside to the wagon without explanation. They were halfway back to Wyatt before he finally spoke. Mr. Whitmore is dying, Harrison said bluntly. The doctor gives him 6 months, maybe a year. He has decided to finalize the transfer of the ranch to me before his health fails completely. His lawyer is drawing up the papers. Josephine absorbed this information, feeling sorrow for the kind old man who had welcomed her so warmly. "I am so sorry, Harrison. I know how much he means to you." "He has been like a father to me," Harrison said, his voice rough with emotion. "Better than my own father, if I am honest. And now he is giving me everything he has built over a lifetime. The responsibility of it is overwhelming." Without thinking, Josephine reached over and placed her hand on his arm. "You are ready for this. He would not trust you with it if you were not." Harrison looked down at her hand, then up at her face. "Thank you for believing that. Sometimes I am not sure I believe it myself." They continued in silence for a while, but it was a comfortable silence, the kind that comes from shared understanding. When they reached the boarding house, Harrison helped her down from the wagon and held her hand for a moment longer than necessary. "Will you come back tomorrow?" he asked. "I know this is not the cheerful experience you probably hoped for, but I would appreciate the company." "Of course I will come back," Josephine said without hesitation. "That is what friends do." "Friends," Harrison repeated softly, testing the word. "Yes, I would like that." Over the following weeks, Josephine fell into a rhythm that felt natural, despite being completely foreign to her previous life. Mornings helping Margaret at the boarding house, afternoons at the Double Bar Ranch learning everything Harrison could teach her. She became competent at riding, improved at handling cattle, and learned to recognize the signs of illness in livestock. Her hands developed calluses, her skin tanned despite the wide-brimmed hat, and her muscles grew stronger from the constant physical work. More importantly, she and Harrison became genuinely close. They talked about everything during the long hours working together, dreams and fears and philosophies of life. He told her about his childhood before his parents died, the struggle to survive afterward, and the gratitude he felt toward Mr. Whitmore for giving him purpose and a future. She shared her own struggles with family expectations, her love of literature and learning, and her growing certainty that she could not return to the life her father wanted for her. Mr. Whitmore's health continued to decline, but he remained sharp and engaged. He watched Harrison and Josephine together with obvious approval, occasionally making comments about what a good ranch wife she would make. Josephine blushed at these suggestions, but did not entirely dismiss them. The thought of staying in Wyatt, of building a life with Harrison on the Double Bar Ranch, had begun to feel less like fantasy and more like possibility. Sarah, the schoolteacher at the boarding house, became a good friend as well. She and Josephine spent evenings together, sometimes reading aloud from books Margaret had collected, sometimes just talking about their lives and hopes. Sarah had come west for reasons similar to Josephine's, seeking freedom from Eastern constraints, and she understood the pull of this hard but honest life. Not everything was peaceful, however. The tension with Jack Mackey's ranch continued to simmer, with occasional incidents of cut fences and boundary disputes. Harrison handled each one with firm diplomacy, but Josephine could see the stress wearing on him. He still had not explained what Mackey had meant during that first confrontation, and Josephine had not pushed, waiting for him to trust her with that piece of his past. The answer came unexpectedly one evening when Josephine was helping serve dinner at the boarding house. One of the clerks from the general store mentioned that he had seen Jack Mackey's sister in town, visiting from St. Louis. The comment seemed innocuous, but Margaret's face tightened in a way that caught Josephine's attention. Later, after the boarders had retired for the night, Josephine asked her aunt about the reaction. Margaret hesitated, clearly torn between discretion and honesty. "It is not my story to tell," Margaret finally said. "But if you are growing as close to Harrison as it appears, you should probably know. Jack Mackey's sister, Catherine, was engaged to Harrison 3 years ago." Josephine felt her heart sink. What happened? Catherine was beautiful and charming, and Harrison fell hard for her. They were planning to marry, had set a date and everything. Then she met a wealthy businessman from St. Louis who was passing through on his way to Kansas City. Within a month, she had broken the engagement and married the businessman instead. Margaret shook her head sadly. Harrison was devastated. And Jack Mackey blamed Harrison for not being good enough for his sister, even though it was Catherine who broke the engagement. The feud between the ranches started shortly after that. That is why Mackey hates him, Josephine said slowly, pieces falling into place. And why Harrison looked so angry when Mackey implied he had secrets. Harrison is a good man who was badly hurt, Margaret said gently. He has not looked at another woman seriously since Catherine left, until now. The implication hung in the air between them, and Josephine could not deny the truth of it. She had feelings for Harrison that went far beyond friendship. And from the way he looked at her sometimes, the gentleness in his touch when he helped her mount a horse or navigate rough terrain, she believed he felt something similar. But the shadow of his past engagement complicated everything. The next day at the ranch, Josephine found it difficult to focus on her tasks. Harrison noticed her distraction during their afternoon ride to check on a herd in the eastern pasture. "Something is bothering you," he observed. "Did I do something wrong?" "No, not at all." Josephine struggled with how to broach the subject, finally deciding on directness. "I heard about your engagement. To Catherine Mackey. I am sorry it ended badly." Harrison's whole body went rigid, and for a moment, Josephine thought he would shut down completely. But then he sighed, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "I wondered when you would hear about that. Small town people talk." "You do not have to discuss it if you do not want to," Josephine said quickly. "I just wanted you to know that I know in case it matters." "It matters," Harrison said quietly. He guided his horse to a stop under a cottonwood tree and dismounted, and Josephine followed suit. They stood in the shade, and Harrison stared out across the prairie before speaking. "I thought Catherine was the love of my life. I was young and stupid, and I believed everything she said about wanting to be a rancher's wife, about loving this life. When she left me for a man with more money and city connections, it felt like proof that I was not good enough, not successful enough, not refined enough, not enough, period." "That was her failure, not yours," Josephine said firmly. "She did not deserve you." Harrison looked at her with an expression that made her breath catch. "You really believe that? I know it. Harrison, you are one of the finest men I have ever met. You work hard, you care deeply about the people and animals in your life, and you have integrity that is rare anywhere, city or frontier. Catherine was a fool to choose money over that." "And what about you?" Harrison asked softly, taking a step closer. "You came from that same world of money and refinement. Will you eventually decide that frontier life is too hard, that a ranch manager is not enough?" Josephine met his eyes steadily, her heart pounding. "I came to Wyatt running away from that world, Harrison. Every day here, working at the ranch, learning this life, it has shown me what really matters. And it is not money or social status or living in a fine house in Philadelphia. It is honest work and real connections with people who matter. It is waking up with purpose and going to sleep satisfied. It is building something meaningful. It is loving someone who sees you for who you really are," Harrison added, and the words hung between them, heavy with meaning. "Yes," Josephine whispered. "Exactly that." Harrison closed the remaining distance between them, his hands coming up to cup her face gently. "I did not expect you, Josephine. I thought I had built walls high enough that no one could get through them. But you did somehow. You walked into my life in a ruined silk dress, and you have turned everything upside down." "Is that a good thing?" Josephine asked, her voice trembling slightly. It is terrifying and wonderful and everything I did not know I needed, Harrison said. Then he leaned down and kissed her, and Josephine felt like she had finally found the place where she belonged. The kiss was gentle at first, almost questioning, but when Josephine wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back with equal fervor, it deepened into something more passionate. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "I am falling in love with you," Harrison said, the words raw with honesty. "I tried not to. I tried to keep my distance. But Josephine, you have become essential to me." "I love you too," Josephine said, the words coming easily because they were true. "I think I have been falling for you since that first day when you handed me those work clothes, instead of judging me for my ruined dress." They stood in the shade of the cottonwood, holding each other, and Josephine felt a peace she had never known before. This was right. This man, this place, this life, it was all exactly what she wanted. Eventually, they had to return to work because the ranch demanded constant attention. But everything felt different now, charged with new meaning. Every shared glance carried weight. Every accidental touch sent sparks through Josephine's body. She knew Harrison felt the same from the way he watched her, protective and tender and full of promise. That evening, when Harrison drove her back to town, they talked about the future for the first time. About what it would mean for Josephine to stay in Wyatt permanently, about whether her father would accept her decision, about how they would manage the ranch together. "You should know what you would be agreeing to," Harrison said seriously. "Ranch life is hard, Josephine. Long hours, constant work, financial uncertainty. Some years are good, some are lean. It would be nothing like the life you could have in Philadelphia." "I do not want the Philadelphia life," Josephine said firmly. "I want this. I want you. I want to build something real and meaningful." "Your father will fight this," Harrison warned. "A ranch manager with no family money or connections is not what he had in mind for you." "My father will have to accept that I am an adult capable of making my own choices," Josephine said, though she knew it would not be that simple. Her father was not a man who accepted defiance easily. The confrontation came sooner than expected. 2 weeks after Josephine and Harrison acknowledged their feelings for each other, a telegram arrived at the boarding house. Her father was coming to Wyatt, arriving within 3 days, with the intention of bringing Josephine home. The banker he had chosen for her had agreed to overlook her summer indiscretion and was still willing to marry her. Margaret showed Josephine the telegram with worried eyes. "What will you do?" "Tell him the truth," Josephine said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "That I am staying in Wyatt, that I intend to marry Harrison, and that he cannot control my life anymore. Darling, I support you completely, but you must understand that your father can make things very difficult. You are not yet 23, and while you are of legal age to make your own decisions, he controls your inheritance and your access to family money." "I do not need his money," Josephine said. "I will make my own way." But saying the words and truly understanding their implications were different things. Over the next 3 days, Josephine wrestled with the reality of what she was choosing. Life on the Double Bar Ranch would mean genuine poverty at times, physical hardship, and social isolation from the world she had grown up in. She would likely lose her inheritance, her connection to her family, and the security of wealth. Harrison noticed her anxiety and confronted her about it the day before her father was due to arrive. They were in the ranch stable, and Harrison stopped her as she was preparing to leave. "You are having second thoughts," he said, not a question but a statement. "About us, about staying." "Not about us," Josephine said quickly. "Never about us. But I would be lying if I said I was not scared about what choosing this life means." "Then do not choose it," Harrison said gently, though she could see the pain in his eyes. I love you, Josephine, which means I want what is best for you. If that life is in Philadelphia with financial security and your family's approval, then I will let you go." "No," Josephine said firmly, surprised by the vehemence in her own voice. "No, Harrison, I am scared, yes. This is a huge decision, but I am not confused about what I want. I want you. I want this life. I just need you to understand that I might not be perfect at it, that I might struggle sometimes with what I have given up." "Everyone struggles," Harrison said, pulling her into his arms. "This life is not easy for anyone, but we will face those struggles together. And when you doubt yourself, I will be there to remind you why you chose this." "I chose it for love," Josephine said, looking up into his face. "For real, honest love that sees me for who I am and values that person. That is worth more than any inheritance." They sealed the promise with a kiss, and when they broke apart, Harrison pulled a small box from his pocket. "I was going to wait until after you dealt with your father, but I think you need this now, to remind you of what we are building together." Inside the box was a simple ring, a silver band with a small turquoise stone. It was not expensive or fancy, but it was beautiful in its simplicity. "It belonged to my mother," Harrison said quietly. "It is the only thing I have left of her. I want you to wear it if you will have me. Marry me, Josephine. Not because I am trying to compete with your father's banker or prove anything to anyone, but because I love you and I want to build a life with you." "Yes," Josephine said, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, I will marry you." Harrison slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. They held each other in the stable, surrounded by the scent of hay and horses, and Josephine felt absolutely certain of her choice. Her father arrived the next day on the afternoon stage, stepping out in his expensive suit and looking around Wyatt with obvious distaste. Josephine met him at the boarding house, with Margaret and Harrison both present for support. She had told Harrison he did not need to be there, that she could face her father alone, but he had refused to let her handle it without him. Richard Hammond was a tall man in his 50s, with graying hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to having his way. He looked at Josephine's work clothes, her tanned skin, and her calloused hands with clear disapproval. "Josephine, this has gone on long enough," he said without preamble. "You have had your summer adventure, but it is time to return home and face your responsibilities. Mr. Pemberton has graciously agreed to proceed with the marriage despite your foolishness." "Mr. Pemberton can marry someone else," Josephine said calmly. "I am not returning to Philadelphia, Father. I am staying in Wyatt. Do not be ridiculous. You cannot possibly mean to stay in this dusty frontier town. You are a Hammond. You have breeding and education. You belong in society, not playing at ranch life." "I am not playing," Josephine said firmly. "I have found meaningful work here, real connections, and a life that fulfills me. I am engaged to be married, Father, to Mr. Harrison Ingram. He manages the Double Bar Ranch and will soon own it outright." Richard Hammond's eyes swiveled to Harrison, assessing him with the cold calculation of a businessman evaluating a bad investment. You think you are good enough for my daughter? A ranch hand with no family, no connections, no prospects beyond working cattle. "I think I love your daughter and will spend my life making her happy," Harrison said evenly, not rising to the provocation. "I can offer her an honest life built on hard work and mutual respect. That may not be what you value, sir, but it is what Josephine wants." Josephine does not know what she wants. She is confused by romantic notions of frontier life that have no bearing on reality. Richard turned back to his daughter. "You understand what you would be giving up? Your inheritance, your position in society, your family connections. You will be cut off from everything if you pursue this foolishness." I understand perfectly, Josephine said, though her heart ached at the threat. And I am still choosing this life. I am choosing Harrison. I am choosing to be happy instead of respectable, fulfilled instead of wealthy, loved instead of tolerated. Then you are a fool, her father said coldly. And you will regret this when the reality of poverty and hardship sets in. Do not come crawling back to Philadelphia when this romance falls apart. I will not need to, Josephine said quietly, because this is not a romance that will fall apart. This is real love, father. Something you would recognize if you had ever prioritized it over social climbing and business connections. The words were harsh, but they needed to be said. Richard Hammond's face flushed with anger, and for a moment Josephine thought he might actually strike her. But Margaret stepped forward, her voice sharp. That is enough, Richard. Josephine is an adult who has made her choice. You can either accept it with grace or leave, but you will not bully her in my house. Richard looked at his sister with betrayal. You encouraged this. You brought her out here specifically to turn her against her family and her responsibilities. I invited her here to give her space to figure out what she wanted from life, Margaret corrected. And she has done exactly that. I am proud of her for having the courage to choose her own path. Richard Hammond gathered what remained of his dignity and looked at his daughter one last time. When this falls apart, do not expect forgiveness. You are making your choice and you will have to live with the consequences. I know, Josephine said sadly, and I will miss you, father. I will miss mother and my brother, but I cannot live my life to please you anymore. I have to live it for myself. Without another word, Richard turned and left the boarding house. Through the window, Josephine watched him stride toward the hotel, his back rigid with anger. She waited until he was out of sight before allowing the tears to fall. Harrison pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly while she cried for the family she was losing, for the relationship with her father that had never been what she needed it to be, and for the security she was giving up. Margaret hovered nearby, offering quiet comfort and understanding. Finally, when the tears subsided, Josephine pulled back and wiped her eyes. I am all right, she said and meant it. It hurts, but I am all right. I made the right choice. You are incredibly brave, Harrison said, his voice rough with emotion. I know how much that cost you. It cost me less than marrying Mr. Pemberton would have, Josephine said honestly. At least now I have something real to show for the loss. Her father left on the next stage out of Wyatt, and Josephine did not see him before he departed. Margaret reported that he had checked out of the hotel early and waited at the stage office rather than risk another encounter. It was a cowardly move, Josephine thought, but also typical of a man who could not handle having his authority questioned. The days following her father's departure were bittersweet. Josephine felt the weight of her decision, the severed connection to her family and her old life. But she also felt free in a way she never had before. Every morning, she woke knowing that the day ahead was hers to shape, that the work she did mattered, and that the man she loved was building a future with her. Mr. Whitmore's health continued to decline through July and into August. The old rancher spent most of his time in bed now, but he insisted on finalizing all the legal paperwork transferring the ranch to Harrison. His lawyer came out from Kansas City multiple times, ensuring everything was properly documented and witnessed. On a warm August afternoon, Mr. Whitmore called Harrison and Josephine to his bedside. He looked frail, the illness having taken a severe toll, but his eyes were still sharp and aware. I want to see you two married before I go, he said without preamble. Harrison, you are the son I never had. Josephine, you have brought joy back to this ranch and to Harrison. It would mean everything to me to witness your wedding. Josephine looked at Harrison, seeing her own emotions reflected in his face. They had talked about getting married in the fall after the hardest ranch work was finished for the year. But how could they deny this man's final request? "We will arrange it immediately," Harrison said, taking Mr. Whitmore's hand. "This week, if Josephine agrees." "Of course I agree," Josephine said softly. "It would be an honor to have you there." They were married 3 days later in the ranch house parlor, with Mr. Whitmore propped up in a chair to witness the ceremony. The preacher from Wyatt's church performed the service, and the attendees included Margaret, Sarah, Mrs. Chen, and several of the ranch hands who had become friends. It was simple and heartfelt, nothing like the elaborate society wedding Josephine's father would have demanded. Josephine wore a simple white dress that Margaret had helped her sew, and Harrison wore his best suit, carefully brushed and pressed for the occasion. When they exchanged vows, promising to love and cherish each other through whatever hardships life brought, Josephine felt the rightness of it deep in her soul. This was her partner, her equal, the man who saw her truly and loved her anyway. Mr. Whitmore cried openly during the ceremony, tears of joy streaming down his weathered face. Afterward, despite his weakness, he insisted on toasting the newlyweds with champagne that Mrs. Chen had somehow acquired from the general store. "To Harrison and Josephine," the old man said, raising his glass. "May your love be as enduring as this land, and may the Double Bar Ranch prosper under your care. You have given this old man more happiness than he deserved." "You deserve every happiness," Harrison said, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved my life when I had nothing. I will never forget that." 2 weeks later, Mr. Whitmore passed away peacefully in his sleep. Harrison found him in the morning, looking serene and at peace. The funeral was attended by nearly everyone in Wyatt and surrounding areas, a testament to the respect the old rancher had earned over his decades in Missouri. He was buried on a hill overlooking the ranch, with a simple headstone that read, "Thomas Whitmore. He loved this land." Harrison grieved deeply, and Josephine supported him through the darkest days, understanding that he had lost not just an employer but a father figure. She helped him work through the emotions, held him when he needed to cry, and gave him space when he needed to be alone. It was her first real test as a wife, and she discovered that loving someone meant being strong when they could not be. With Mr. Whitmore's death, Harrison became the full owner of the Double Bar Ranch, a responsibility that weighed heavily on him. There were debts to settle, business decisions to make, and the ongoing challenge of running a successful operation. Josephine threw herself into learning every aspect of ranch management, becoming a true partner in the enterprise. She learned to keep the ranch's books, tracking expenses and income with the mathematical skills her Philadelphia education had provided. She learned to treat sick cattle, to recognize quality horses, to negotiate with buyers at the railhead. Some days were overwhelming and she collapsed into bed exhausted, wondering if she was truly capable of this life. But Harrison was always there, encouraging her, teaching her, reminding her that they were in this together. The feud with Jack Mackey continued to simmer throughout that fall and into winter. There were more incidents of sabotage, more boundary disputes, and increasing tension. Harrison tried to handle everything diplomatically, but Mackey seemed determined to make trouble. The situation came to a head in November, when several double-bar cattle turned up dead on Mackey land, poisoned by contaminated water. Harrison was devastated by the loss and certain that Mackey was responsible, though he could not prove it. Josephine watched her husband struggle with the desire for revenge and his commitment to handling things legally. Finally, Harrison rode over to the Mackey ranch to confront Jack directly, and this time Josephine insisted on going with him. She would not let her husband face this alone. They found Jack Mackey in his barn, and the man's face darkened when he saw them. "What do you want, Ingram? Come to make more false accusations. My cattle are dead, Mackey, poisoned. That water source is on your land, and those cattle could not have gotten there unless someone cut my fence again and drove them onto your property." "You cannot prove anything," Mackey shot back. "Maybe your wife here does not know how to maintain fences properly. I hear she is learning ranch work. Maybe she is not as capable as you think." "Leave her out of this," Harrison said dangerously. "This is between you and me." "Is it? Because from where I stand, you stole everything that should have been mine. My sister loved you, and you drove her away with your poverty and your lack of ambition. Then you found yourself another rich Eastern girl to support your failing ranch. How long before this one realizes what my sister did, that you are not worth staying for?" Josephine had heard enough. She stepped forward, her voice calm but cold. "Your sister did not leave because Harrison lacked ambition, Mr. Mackey. She left because she valued money over love and comfort over character. That was her choice, her failure. And she is the one who lost, because Harrison is worth 10 of your businessman brother-in-law." Mackey's face flushed with rage. "You do not know anything about my family. I know that you have been sabotaging the Double Bar Ranch for years because you cannot accept that your sister made a mistake," Josephine continued, her anger building. "I know that you blame Harrison for her choices instead of holding her accountable. And I know that if you continue this vendetta, we will involve the law. We have documented every incident, every cut fence, every suspicious death. We have witnesses and evidence. Stop this now, or face the consequences." The threat hung in the air, and for a moment Josephine thought Mackey might attack them both. But Harrison stood beside her, solid and supportive, and together they presented a united front that even Mackey's anger could not break through. "This is not over," Mackey finally said, but there was less conviction in his voice. "Yes, it is," Harrison said quietly. "Let it go, Jack. Catherine made her choice years ago. Stop punishing me for it. Stop punishing yourself. Move on." They left without waiting for a response, riding back to the Double Bar in tense silence. But from that day forward, the sabotage stopped. Whether Mackey had actually been responsible, or whether Josephine's threat had scared off whoever was causing the problems, Harrison's ranch operations returned to normal. Winter in Missouri was harsh, with freezing temperatures and occasional snow that made ranch work even more challenging. Josephine learned to break ice on water troughs, to ensure the cattle had adequate shelter, to recognize the signs of frostbite in animals and humans alike. She and Harrison worked side by side through the brutal months, relying on each other for strength and warmth. Their marriage deepened during that difficult winter. They learned each other's rhythms, discovered how to communicate without words, and built a partnership based on mutual respect and shared labor. Some nights they were too exhausted for anything but sleep, collapsing into bed and waking up tangled together. Other nights, despite the cold and the hardship, they made love with a passion that reminded them why they had chosen this life together. Spring brought new life to the ranch. Calves were born, requiring round-the-clock attention. Josephine became skilled at assisting difficult births, working alongside Harrison to ensure the survival of as many animals as possible. It was messy, exhausting work, but also deeply satisfying. Each healthy calf represented future prosperity, proof that their hard work was paying off. In late March, Josephine realized she had missed her monthly cycle. At first, she attributed it to stress and the physical demands of ranch life. But when she missed a second cycle and began experiencing morning nausea, she could no longer deny the truth. She was pregnant. The realization filled her with a mixture of joy and terror. She wanted children with Harrison, wanted to build a family on the Double Bar Ranch. But pregnancy and childbirth on the frontier were dangerous, and she knew women who had died from complications. The nearest doctor was in the next county, over an hour's ride away. She told Harrison that evening after dinner, watching his face carefully for his reaction. He was silent for a long moment, processing the information. Then a slow smile spread across his face, transforming his expression into pure joy. "A baby," he said wonderingly. "We are having a baby." "Are you happy?" Josephine asked, needing to hear the words. "I am terrified and thrilled and completely overwhelmed," Harrison admitted, pulling her into his arms. "A baby, Josephine. A child of our own. A family." They held each other in the ranch house kitchen, imagining the future that was growing inside Josephine's body. A child who would be born into this life of hard work and simple pleasures, who would learn to love the land as they did, who would carry on the legacy of the Double Bar Ranch. The pregnancy progressed well through spring and into summer. Margaret insisted that Josephine reduce her physical work on the ranch, and Harrison became almost comically protective, trying to prevent her from doing anything remotely strenuous. Josephine fought against the restrictions at first, not wanting to be treated as fragile. But as her belly grew and movement became more difficult, she accepted the help with gratitude. The women of Wyatt rallied around her, sharing advice and experiences, providing support and reassurance. Sarah visited often, bringing books and conversation to keep Josephine's mind engaged during the long days when she could not do ranch work. Mrs. Chen taught her to knit, and Josephine spent hours creating tiny garments for the baby. Harrison converted one of the spare bedrooms into a nursery, building a cradle with his own hands from wood he carefully selected and sanded smooth. He worked on it in the evenings, and Josephine would sit nearby, watching his strong hands create something beautiful for their child. Those quiet evenings together, preparing for the baby's arrival, were some of the happiest of her life. In early October, when the first hints of autumn colored the prairie grass, Josephine went into labor. Margaret and Mrs. Chen were with her, having moved into the ranch house the week before in preparation. Harrison paced outside the bedroom, his anxiety palpable to everyone in the house. Labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the following day. Josephine endured waves of pain unlike anything she had experienced, questioning whether she was strong enough to survive this. But Margaret held her hand, coached her breathing, and reminded her that women had been doing this since the beginning of time. She was strong enough. She could do this. Finally, as the sun reached its zenith on the second day, the baby arrived. A boy, healthy and strong, with a powerful set of lungs that he demonstrated immediately. Josephine held him for the first time, exhausted and elated, looking down at the tiny face that was somehow both Harrison's and hers. Harrison came into the room, his face pale with worry that transformed into wonder when he saw his wife and son. He approached slowly, almost reverently, and Josephine placed the baby in his arms. Harrison held his son with infinite care, tears streaming down his face. "He is perfect," Harrison whispered. "Josephine, he is absolutely perfect." They named him Henry after Harrison's father, with the middle name Thomas to honor Mr. Whitmore. Henry Thomas Ingram, the next generation of the Double Bar Ranch. The years that followed were filled with the joys and challenges of raising a child while managing a working ranch. Henry grew from infant to toddler to small boy, learning to walk on the ranch's dusty ground, chasing chickens through the yard, and sitting on his father's horse from the time he could hold on. Josephine discovered that motherhood, like ranch life, was harder and more rewarding than she had imagined. Sleepless nights with a crying baby, constant worry about illness and injury, The exhaustion of caring for a young child while helping run the ranch, all of it, tested her limits. But watching Henry grow, seeing Harrison's face light up when his son called him Papa, feeling the weight of her child in her arms, those moments made every challenge worthwhile. The Double Bar Ranch prospered under Harrison and Josephine's management. They modernized some operations, maintained the traditional approaches that Mr. Whitmore had perfected, and slowly built a reputation for quality cattle and fair dealing. Money was sometimes tight, especially in lean years, but they always managed to make ends meet through hard work and careful planning. When Henry was 3, Josephine discovered she was pregnant again. This pregnancy was easier than the first, perhaps because she knew what to expect, and in the spring of their 6th year of marriage, they welcomed a daughter. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's whiskey-colored eyes, and they named her Margaret Rose after Josephine's aunt who had made their life together possible. Margaret Hammond, now well into her 60s, was delighted to have a namesake. She spent countless hours with her great niece, spoiling her shamelessly and teaching her all the things she had taught Josephine about being a strong, independent woman. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Mornings began early with ranch work. Afternoons involved caring for the children and managing the household. Evenings were spent together as a family. Harrison taught Henry to ride, to recognize different breeds of cattle, to understand the land. Josephine taught both children to read, to appreciate books and learning, to value education alongside practical skills. The children grew up understanding both worlds, the refinement of Josephine's Eastern upbringing and the hard practicality of Harrison's frontier life. They learned proper manners and literature from their mother, horsemanship and ranch management from their father. They were equally comfortable in the ranch house parlor and the cattle corrals. Sometimes Josephine thought about her father, wondered if he ever regretted cutting her off so completely. Margaret received occasional letters from Josephine's mother, sent secretly without her husband's knowledge, containing news of the family and expressions of love for the grandchildren she had never met. Josephine cherished these letters, grateful for the connection even if it had to be hidden. Her brother, who had been studying law when she left Philadelphia, eventually reached out directly. He had married, started his own family, and wanted to rebuild the relationship with his sister. Josephine was cautious at first, wounded by years of silence, but gradually they reconnected through letters that grew increasingly warm and honest. One day, when Henry was 8 and Margaret Rose was 5, a letter arrived from her brother containing unexpected news. Their father had suffered a stroke and was asking for Josephine. He wanted to see her, to meet his grandchildren, to make amends before it was too late. Josephine showed the letter to Harrison, and they discussed it late into the night. Harrison left the decision entirely to her, supporting whatever she chose. Finally, Josephine decided they would make the journey to Philadelphia. Not to reconcile completely or to pretend the past had not happened, but to allow her father the chance to know his grandchildren and to find some closure for herself. The trip east was an adventure for Henry and Margaret Rose, who had never left Missouri. They traveled by train, a luxury that the ranch could now afford thanks to years of successful operations. Philadelphia overwhelmed them with its size and noise and crowds, so different from the open spaces of home. Josephine's father was indeed much changed by his illness, confined to a wheelchair and speaking with difficulty. But when he saw his grandchildren, something in his face softened. He looked at Henry's confident stance and Margaret Rose's curious intelligence, and Josephine saw him recognize the quality of their upbringing. Over the week they spent in Philadelphia, a tentative peace was reached. Richard Hammond could not undo the years of estrangement or take back his harsh words, but he acknowledged in his limited way that Josephine had built a good life, that her children were remarkable, that perhaps he had been wrong about what she needed. "They are fine children," he told Josephine during one of their conversations. "You and your husband have done well by them." It was not a full apology, but it was something. Josephine accepted it for what it was, an old man's limited ability to admit error and let go of the anger she had carried for years. She would never have the relationship with her father that she wanted, but she could stop letting his disapproval define her. The reunion with her mother was more emotional. Josephine's mother cried openly at seeing her daughter again, at holding her grandchildren, at witnessing the evidence of Josephine's happiness. They spent hours talking, catching up on lost time, and Josephine realized how much her mother had sacrificed by staying with a difficult husband who demanded compliance. When they returned to Missouri, to the Double Bar Ranch and the life they had built, Josephine felt a sense of completeness she had not realized was missing. She had faced her past, made peace with what could not be changed, and returned to her real home with certainty that she had made the right choices. The years continued to pass, marked by the changing seasons and the growth of their children. Henry developed into a capable young man who loved the ranch as much as his father did, learning every aspect of its operation with eager enthusiasm. Margaret Rose showed an early talent for numbers and organization, taking over the ranch books when she was barely 12 and managing them better than Josephine ever had. More children followed. Twin boys when Josephine was 30, born during a spring thunderstorm that rattled the ranch house windows. They named them William and James, and they were as different as two boys could be despite their identical appearance. William was quiet and thoughtful, James loud and adventurous. Together they kept the household in constant motion. The ranch continued to prosper, expanding its operations gradually. They acquired additional land, improved their breeding stock, and built a reputation that extended beyond Missouri. Harrison's business acumen, combined with Josephine's education and organizational skills, made them a formidable team. Buyers knew that a Double Bar Ranch animal was quality, and that the Ingram's word was good. Sarah, the school teacher, eventually married one of the ranch hands who worked for the Double Bar. She and Josephine remained close friends through the years, their children growing up together, their lives intertwined in the way that happens in small communities where everyone depends on each other. Margaret Hammond lived to see all her great-nieces and great-nephews, delighting in each one. She passed away peacefully in her sleep when Josephine was 35, having lived a full and adventurous life on her own terms. Josephine mourned her aunt deeply, grateful for the woman who had given her the space to discover who she truly was. As the children grew older and began making their own way in the world, Josephine and Harrison found themselves with more time to simply be together. They would ride out across the ranch land in the evenings, just the two of them, watching the sun set over the prairie and talking about their lives. "Do you ever regret it?" Harrison asked her one evening when they had been married for 20 years. "Giving up your inheritance, your family connections, everything you could have had in Philadelphia." Josephine looked at the land spread out before them, at the ranch house in the distance where their children were probably getting into some kind of mischief, at the man beside her who had been her partner through everything. "Not for a single moment," she said honestly. "This life, this family, it is worth more than all the money in Philadelphia. I would make the same choice 1,000 times over." Harrison smiled and reached for her hand. "You came here in a ruined silk dress, completely unprepared for ranch life, and you became the finest ranch woman I have ever known. You amaze me, Josephine. You handed me work clothes and taught me everything I needed to know, Josephine replied. You saw past the silk dress to the woman underneath. You gave me the chance to become who I was meant to be. They sat together as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. 20 years of marriage, of partnership, of building something meaningful together. 20 years of hard work and simple joys, of challenges overcome and victories celebrated. 20 years of love that had only deepened with time. Henry eventually took over the day-to-day management of the Double Bar Ranch, proving himself as capable as his father. Margaret Rose married a lawyer from Kansas City, but maintained her connection to the ranch, returning often with her own children. The twins went different directions. William became a veterinarian specializing in cattle, while James joined the cavalry, seeking adventure beyond the ranch. As Josephine and Harrison entered their later years, they stepped back from the intensive labor of ranching, becoming advisors and historians of the Double Bar. They spent their days working in the garden Josephine had cultivated over the years, taking long rides across land they knew like the lines on their own hands, and spoiling grandchildren who visited from various parts of the country. Josephine never returned to the person she had been when she stepped off that stagecoach in her expensive silk dress. That woman had been lost, unsure of herself, seeking something she could not name. The woman she became was strong, capable, certain of her place in the world. She had calloused hands and sun-weathered skin, could deliver a calf, or break a horse, or balance ranch accounts with equal skill. She had built a life of meaning and purpose, raised children who understood the value of hard work and honest dealing, and loved a man who had been her partner in every sense of the word. On their 40th wedding anniversary, their children and grandchildren gathered at the Double Bar Ranch to celebrate. The ranch house was filled with noise and laughter, with multiple generations coming together to honor the love that had started it all. Harrison and Josephine stood on the porch watching their family, and Josephine felt overwhelming gratitude for the path her life had taken. 40 years, Harrison said, his arm around her waist. Sometimes it feels like 40 days. It has passed so quickly. Best 40 years of my life, Josephine said, leaning into his embrace. Every single moment, even the hard ones. Especially the hard ones, Harrison agreed. Those are the moments that showed us what we were made of, what we could accomplish together. Their eldest grandchild, Henry's daughter, approached with something in her hands. Grandmother, we found this in one of the old trunks upstairs. Is this yours? It was the silk dress, the one Josephine had ruined on her first day in Wyatt. Someone had carefully preserved it over the decades, the tear in the fabric still visible, a reminder of where it all began. Josephine took the dress, running her fingers over the expensive fabric that had once meant so much to her. Now it was just cloth, a relic of a different person's life. Yes, sweetheart. I wore this the day I arrived in Wyatt, the day I met your grandfather. Tell us the story, the girl pleaded, and soon all the grandchildren were gathered around, begging for the tale they had heard many times before but never tired of. So Josephine told them, with Harrison adding details here and there, about the city woman who arrived in her fancy silk dress and ruined it within minutes. About the cowboy who handed her work clothes instead of judging her inadequacy. About learning to ride and work cattle. About standing up to her father. About building a life from nothing but love and determination. The grandchildren listened with rapt attention, and when the story was finished, the youngest one asked, "Grandmother, do you wish you had not ruined your pretty dress?" Josephine looked at Harrison, at the life they had built together, at the family surrounding them. No, darling. That ruined dress was the best thing that ever happened to me. It was the beginning of everything that matters. As the celebration continued around them, Josephine and Harrison slipped away to the spot where he had proposed all those years ago, under the cottonwood tree that had grown larger and more beautiful with time. They stood together in the fading light, and Josephine thought about the journey that had brought them here. She had come to Wyatt running from something: her father's expectations, society's constraints, a life that did not fit who she was. But she had found something far more valuable: a life of purpose, work that mattered, love that endured, and the freedom to be exactly who she wanted to be. "Thank you," she said to Harrison, the words encompassing everything they had shared. "For what?" he asked, though his smile suggested he knew. "For seeing me, for loving me, for building this incredible life with me, for every moment of these 40 years. "Thank you for staying," Harrison replied, pulling her close. "For choosing this life, for choosing me, for being the strongest, most amazing woman I have ever known. For making the Double Bar Ranch a true home." They kissed as the sun set over the Missouri prairie, two people who had found each other against all odds and built something that would last far beyond their own lifetimes. The ranch would continue through their children and grandchildren, each generation adding their own contributions while honoring the foundation that Josephine and Harrison had laid. As darkness fell and they walked hand in hand back to the ranch house filled with family, Josephine felt complete contentment. Her life had not turned out anything like she had imagined when she was a young woman in Philadelphia. It had been harder, messier, more challenging than anything she could have anticipated. It had also been infinitely more rewarding, more meaningful, more full of genuine love and connection. The silk dress that hung in the guest room closet, carefully preserved as a family heirloom, represented the woman she used to be. The work clothes she still wore daily, mended and patched over the years, represented the woman she had become. And she would not trade one for the other for all the money and status in the world. That night, lying in bed beside Harrison as they had for 40 years, Josephine reflected on the miracle of her life. A chance encounter, a ruined dress, a cowboy's kindness, such small things to build a lifetime on. But they had been enough, more than enough. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," Harrison replied, his voice drowsy with approaching sleep. "Always have, always will." Josephine smiled and closed her eyes, secure in the knowledge that she had lived fully, loved deeply, and built something that mattered. The city woman who had ruined her silk dress on day one had become the ranch woman who had helped build a legacy. And it had all started with a cowboy who had handed her work clothes and smiled, seeing past her expensive exterior to the woman she was capable of becoming. As sleep claimed her, Josephine's last thoughts were of gratitude for the life she had chosen, for the man who had walked beside her every step of the way, and for the courage she had found within herself to become who she was always meant to be. The Double Bar Ranch would continue long after she and Harrison were gone, a testament to the power of love, hard work, and the willingness to embrace a life of meaning over a life of mere comfort. Outside, the Missouri wind whispered through the prairie grass, the same wind that had blown on the day she arrived. But now this was home, truly and completely, in a way that Philadelphia had never been. And that ruined silk dress, hanging in the closet as a reminder of where it all began, was worth more than any intact gown could ever be. Because it represented the moment everything changed, the moment her real life began.